All right, let's go. Number 10. The Qumran Baptismal Complex. Roland de Vaux didn't know what he was walking into. The Dominican friar and archaeologist had spent years directing the École Biblique et Archéologique Française in Jerusalem when excavations at Khirbet Qumran began in 1951. On a limestone plateau overlooking the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, he found pools. Not one pool, 10 of them. Stepped architecturally deliberate, with descending staircases cut into the plaster-lined stone. 6 of the 10 met the formal rabbinic definition of a mikveh, the Jewish ritual immersion pool, in water volume and construction. The site had been continuously occupied since the 2nd century BCE. These pools had been in use, by the same community, for generation after generation, more than 160 years before John the Baptist first waded into the Jordan River. Jody Magnus, professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, published her comprehensive analysis in 2002. The Archaeology of Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls, issued by Eerdmans, documented the full construction sequence. The water channels cut into the cliff face above the site to route winter rainfall into the pools, the cisterns, the distribution system, and the wear patterns on the steps themselves. Physical, visible, obvious wear, the kind that accumulates from thousands of individual feet descending and ascending in water over decades and generations. The community rule, 1QS, the scroll found in Cave 1 that functioned as the community's foundational document, is unambiguous on what the pools meant. The water does not purify by itself. If the person descending is not genuinely, inwardly repentant, if they have not turned toward God in the deepest sense, the water accomplishes nothing. The immersion is the external, visible sign of an internal, spiritual transformation that must already be occurring. The outward act points to the inward reality. The physical points to the spiritual. That is the theology of John the Baptist. That is the theology of Christian baptism. The same understanding, water immersion signals something happening in the spirit, marks entry into a transformed relationship with God, means nothing without the inner reality, was already encoded in the daily practice of a desert community a century and a half before the first baptism accounts in the Gospels were written. The pools are still there, open to the sky at Khirbet Qumran, the steps still carrying their wear, the plaster lining still tracing the channels. What those steps record, in stone, in physical fact, is not a Christian idea that appeared in the 1st century CE. It is a Jewish idea, specifically and theologically developed, already practiced in stone and water, 160 years before anyone used that practice to describe what Jesus of Nazareth meant. That's what baptism looks like before Christianity existed to name it. Now, if you want to go deeper into the physical evidence confirming what the biblical text describes, the artifacts, the excavations, the inscriptions, I put together a 60-page ebook covering all of it. Real sites, real scholars, real digs. The link is in the description. Worth having if this kind of content is why you're here. Number 9. The Therapeutae. Around the year 40 CE, an Alexandrian Jewish philosopher named Philo sat down to write a description of a community he had personally observed. He was one of the most learned men of the 1st century, politically connected, prolific, deeply educated in both Hebrew scriptures and Greek philosophy. When he wrote De Vita Contemplativa, on the contemplative life, he was producing a careful ethnographic description of a Jewish community living outside Alexandria on the shore of Lake Merotis in Egypt. He called them the Therapeutae, a Greek word meaning healers or worshippers, the ambiguity deliberate. And the portrait he drew of them is one of the most disorienting documents in the ancient world, for a reason that only becomes apparent once you know what comes later. The Therapeutae were Jewish. They predated the ministry of Jesus. This community existed and was observed by Philo before the crucifixion, before Paul's letters, before any Christian presence in Alexandria is attested. And the way they organized their communal life reads, detail by detail, like the charter of a Christian monastic institution that would not formally appear in history for another 3 centuries. Philo describes the entry process. Members renounce private property, transferring their wealth to family members or releasing it entirely, and arrive at the community without possessions. He describes the practice of celibacy as normative. He describes the individual study cells where members spend their days in solitary contemplation of sacred texts, not communal life all day, but a rhythm of private study broken by communal gathering. He describes the weekly sacred assembly held in a common hall, with members arranged in order of their seniority in the community, reclining at the head if they have been present longest, seated lower if they are newer. He describes the meal itself: bread, water, herbs, simple, deliberate, structured around communal identity rather than celebration of abundance. And then he describes the hymns. After the meal, the community rises and forms two choirs, one of men, one of women. They sing antiphonally. The men's choir takes a verse, the women's respond, alternating back and forth in structured worship that continues. Philo says, until the light of dawn appears. All night, two choirs alternating verses. In a common hall outside Alexandria, sometime before 40 CE, when Eusebius of Caesarea, the great 4th century church historian, read Philo's account, around 314 CE, he made a decisive interpretive move that would shape Christian historiography for centuries. He declared that Philo was describing early Christians, specifically converts produced by the church that Mark founded in Alexandria. The monastic practices Philo described were Christian in origin, Eusebius argued. The resemblance to what the church would later call monastic life was because these were, in fact, early monks. The problem, as David Rumia of Leiden University documents exhaustively in his 1993 study Philo in Early Christian Literature, published by Fortress Press, is that the chronology makes Eusebius's interpretation impossible. Philo is writing around 40 CE about a community that already exists and has been operating long enough to have a full structure and established seniority ranks. The Therapeutae were operating before any Markan church could have been established, before there was a Christian institution for anyone to join. What Eusebius was doing, and Runia's analysis makes this unmistakable, was recognizing a resemblance and working backwards from it to manufacture an origin story that preserved Christian priority. The manuscripts of Philo's writings tell their own story. They were preserved almost entirely by Christian libraries. Jewish communities largely stopped copying Philo in late antiquity. Christian scriptoria in Europe maintained the textual tradition. The writings that describe a pre-Christian Jewish community as the template for Christian monastic life were preserved by the very institutions that needed them most to look like confirmation, not precedent. Philo did not mean to write a prophecy. He was writing a description. A first-century Jewish intellectual sitting in Alexandria, recording what he had observed in a community of Jews living in contemplative dedication on a lake outside the city. He had no idea, as he wrote, that the institution he was describing would one day be claimed as a Christian invention. He was just taking notes. Number 8, the Maccabean martyrs, and the birth of resurrection theology. In 167 BCE, the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes walked into the Jerusalem temple and desecrated it. He sacrificed a pig on the altar of burnt offering. He erected an altar to Zeus in the sanctuary. He issued decrees forbidding Torah observance, forbidding circumcision, forbidding Sabbath, forbidding the food laws, and then he enforced those decrees with executions. What followed was the Maccabean crisis, one of the most consequential religious emergencies in Jewish history. And in the literature it produced, for the first time in any surviving ancient document, we find an explicit, individual, bodily resurrection theology that Christianity would place at the absolute center of its entire belief system more than a century later. The account is preserved in 2nd Maccabees. Scholars date the composition of this book to approximately 124 BCE, a condensed summary of an earlier 5-volume history by Jason of Cyrene. That gives us a text written in Greek, preserved through Jewish and later Christian transmission, dated with reasonable confidence to more than a century before Jesus was born. The book describes the torture and execution of a Jewish elder named Eleazar, and then of a mother with her 7 sons. Their crime is refusing to eat pork, to visibly and publicly violate Torah under royal duress. They have the option of apostasy. They choose death. What matters is not the martyrdom itself. Martyrdom narratives existed before this. What matters is what the martyrs say while dying. One by one, the brothers make statements about their expectations after death. And those statements are not vague. They are not metaphorical. They do not describe the soul ascending to a higher realm, drifting free of the corrupt body into Greek-style immortality. They describe bodily resurrection, the physical reconstitution of the actual body that is being destroyed, as the anticipated outcome for those who die faithful to God. One brother holds out his hands to be mutilated, and says that he expects to receive them back from God. Another, dying, says that dying at human hands while holding to God's promises is the path toward being raised up again. Jonathan Goldstein's commentary on 2nd Maccabees in the Anchor Bible series, published by Doubleday in 1983. Goldstein, trained at Princeton and teaching for decades at the University of Iowa, traces the theological development here with the precision of a scholar who spent years with the text. The distinction he draws is crucial. The Hellenistic idea of immortality, the one circulating in the Greek-speaking world throughout the same period, is the soul's escape from the body. The body is the problem. In that framework, the soul, freed from it at death, finally reaches its true existence. The Maccabean theology is different in kind and harder to derive from Greek sources. It is the body that gets raised, the physical person, the actual flesh that was cut and burned and destroyed. God reverses that destruction. The martyr's body is restored. That is the precise claim at the center of the Eastern narrative. Not a spiritual transformation, not a symbolic resurrection. The physical body of Jesus raised from an actual tomb. When Paul writes to the Corinthian church around 55 CE and describes the resurrection, he is working in a framework that already has more than a century and a half of Jewish theological development behind it. Resurrection imagery appears in Qumran texts entirely independent of 2nd Maccabees, meaning this was not an isolated theological invention, but a live current running through multiple Second Temple Jewish communities simultaneously. What makes this particularly difficult to account for is the directionality. Christianity did not invent the resurrection. It made a specific historical claim. This man, this tomb, this Sunday morning in Jerusalem, within a theological framework that was already complete, already documented, already being discussed in Jewish communities for more than a century before the crucifixion. Whether the specific claim is true is a separate question entirely. But the framework was already written, already believed, already the basis for how faithful Jews understood extreme suffering. 2nd Maccabees is not a Christian text. It was written by Jews for Jews about a Jewish crisis. And somewhere in the 120 SBCE, the author wrote the first explicit case for bodily resurrection in the surviving ancient record, writing down what Eleazar said while they were killing him, not knowing the framework he was articulating would one day belong to a different religion entirely. Number 7. Philo of Alexandria and the pre-Christian Logos. Around 20 BCE, a boy was born in Alexandria into one of the most prominent Jewish families in Egypt. He received the best Greek education available, read deeply in Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics, and spent his adult life attempting a systematic philosophical reconciliation of the Hebrew scriptures with Greek thought. His name was Philo, and in the process of doing that work, he developed a concept that would make the New Testament possible. He called it the Logos. In Greek philosophy, Logos had several meanings: word, reason, rational principle, the intelligible structure of the cosmos. For Philo, those philosophical categories were a way of talking about something he found in the Hebrew scriptures: the divine word by which God created the world, the wisdom present at creation described in the book of Proverbs, the divine intermediary who appears to the patriarchs. He fused them. Philo's Logos is not simply a concept. It is a divine entity, the firstborn Son of God, the image of God, the instrument through whom God created the cosmos, not by direct contact, which would violate God's perfect transcendence, but through the Logos as mediating agent. The Logos is the heavenly high priest who stands between God and the world, presenting human prayers to God and divine illumination to humanity. The Logos is neither fully God nor merely created. Philo strains for language that puts the Logos in a genuinely intermediate position, participating in both the divine and the created without being reducible to either. The Gospel of John was composed somewhere between 90 and 100 CE, decades after Philo's death, around 50 CE. Its opening lines deploy a philosophical vocabulary that any educated Greek speaker in the first century would recognize immediately. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Through him all things were made. He became flesh and dwelt among us. The conceptual apparatus, pre-existent divine intermediary, with God from before creation, agent of creation, made accessible to humanity in a new way, is Philo's apparatus. The vocabulary, the philosophical structure, the metaphysical framework are the same. John's prologue is not a fresh philosophical invention. It is the application of an already developed, already circulating Jewish theological concept to a specific historical claim, that this Logos became a particular person who lived in Galilee and died in Jerusalem. David Runia of Leiden University in his 1993 study Philo in Early Christian Literature, published by Fortress Press, documents the pattern across the manuscript tradition. Jewish communities stopped copying Philo's texts in late antiquity. Christian scriptoria preserved them. The Vatican Library and the Laurentian Library in Florence hold the major manuscript traditions. Early Christian theologians read Philo, engaged with Philo, and found in his Logos theology a philosophical framework already built for the claim they were making about Jesus. When Eusebius encountered Philo's writings in the 4th century, he solved the resemblance problem by inventing a meeting. He claimed Philo had personally encountered the Apostle Peter in Rome, and that the resemblance between Philo's Logos theology and Christian teaching about the divine word made flesh was because Philo had absorbed the Christian proclamation. The meeting is almost certainly fictional. No corroborating evidence exists. The chronology is strained, and the sophistication of Philo's Logos concept predates any point at which Peter's preaching could plausibly have produced such elaborate results. What the manuscript record shows, plainly, is that Philo developed the divine Logos as firstborn Son of God before Christianity existed. Christianity found the concept philosophically serviceable and preserved the manuscripts that contained it. A Jewish philosopher working in Alexandria, trying to explain his ancestral scriptures to a Greek-speaking world, built the conceptual architecture that a later movement would use to explain a claim he never encountered. The Logos was in circulation, in writing, philosophically developed, 40 years before the gospel that applied it was written. Number 6. The Damascus Document and the Pre-Christian New Covenant. In the summer of 1896, Solomon Schechter climbed into an attic. He was a Cambridge professor, Romanian-born, already known in the world of Jewish manuscript studies, and he had recently received a tip about a document fragment discovered in Cairo. When the tip proved genuine, he traveled to Cairo and secured permission to remove documents from the Geniza of the Ben Ezra synagogue, the room where worn-out sacred texts were kept rather than destroyed. Sealed up and accumulating since the 9th century CE. What Schechter pulled out of that attic over the following weeks filled boxes, thousands of fragments, among them pieces of an ancient Jewish document unlike anything previously known. He published his critical edition in 1910 under the title Fragments of a Zadokite Work. Scholars eventually called it the Damascus Document, and sitting near the center of it was a phrase, 3 Hebrew words, that would take on enormous significance once the Dead Sea Scrolls began to emerge from the Judean desert 50 years later. Beret Hadashah, the New Covenant. Those 3 words are the theological cornerstone of the entire Christian understanding of what Jesus accomplished. The author of the letter to the Hebrews uses the phrase explicitly, more than once, to describe the covenant enacted through the crucifixion. Paul uses the concept as the organizing framework of his theology. The Eucharistic tradition recorded in the Synoptic Gospels turns on it. The cup is the cup of the new covenant, poured out for many. This is not a minor term. It is the central claim of Christianity, that through Jesus, God was doing something new, establishing a new covenant relationship with humanity that superseded the covenant of Sinai. The old had given way to the new. And here that exact phrase was, in an ancient Jewish manuscript, in a Cairo attic, in a text that predated the ministry of Jesus. When Cave 4 at Qumran was excavated in the 1950s, among the thousands of fragments emerging from the most prolific of the desert caves were portions of what would be designated 4 QD. The Qumran copies of the Damascus Document, paleographic dating placed the Qumran copies in the 1st century BCE. The text itself, on internal evidence, references to historical events, the nature of its polemic, its relationship to other Qumran documents, was composed earlier still, probably in the 2nd century BCE. The Damascus Document is not a 1st century CE text that was copied to Qumran. It is a pre-Christian Jewish community document that arrived at Qumran after existing somewhere else first. Lawrence Schiffman of New York University, in his 1994 work Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls, issued by the Jewish Publication Society, analyzes the Damascus Document's institutional structure in detail. What he finds is a fully developed community organization built around the Beret Hadashah concept, with institutional features that map onto early Christian community structure point for point. The document describes a formal entry process. Prospective members are evaluated over a period before being admitted to the full covenant community. It describes arrangements for communal property within the community. It describes a shared meal as a central communal ritual. It describes an overseer, the Mabakar in Hebrew, who is responsible for the spiritual welfare of the entire community. who interviews new members and makes determinations about their suitability, who adjudicates disputes between members, who is explicitly compared in the text to a shepherd caring for a flock. It describes expulsion procedures for members who violate community standards after being admitted. It describes the community's self-understanding as a gathered remnant, separated from the corrupt mainstream of Israelite religious life, living under this new covenant while awaiting the eschatological events that will vindicate them. The structural correspondences with early Christian community organization are not vague or metaphorical. The Bakaker maps onto the Christian episkopos, the bishop or overseer, with a precision of function that is striking. The communal property arrangements appear in the Acts of the Apostles' account of the Jerusalem church in its earliest years. The entry covenant and evaluation period appear in Christian baptismal preparation practice. The expulsion protocol, shepherd language, and flock imagery appear throughout the Gospel accounts and Pauline letters. The Taylor-Schechter collection at Cambridge University Library holds the original Cairo-Geniza fragments Schechter removed in 1896. They are physically there, cataloged, accessible to scholars. The Qumran copies are held by the Israel Antiquities Authority and the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem. These are not disputed texts. They are not forgeries. They are a pre-Christian Jewish community document organized around a concept, the New Covenant, and a set of institutional practices that Christianity would claim as its own defining theological and organizational innovations. The community behind the Damascus Document understood itself as living inside a new covenant with God, one that required formal entry, communal accountability, shared resources, an overseer who functioned as a shepherd, and the expectation of vindication at the end of days. They did not know that a movement was coming that would claim the same language, the same covenant concept, the same organizational structures, and attach them to a single person who would, within a century of the Damascus Document's composition, be born in Bethlehem. The New Covenant was not invented in an upper room in Jerusalem. It was already in an attic in Cairo. It just took us until 1896 to go up and look for it. Quick one, if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. Drop a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is there. I read every single one of them. Number 5, 4Q52. 1. The Messianic Apocalypse. In 1956, Bedouin tribesmen working the cave system in the Judean cliffs above the Dead Sea reached Cave 4 at Qumran, the richest archaeological find of the modern era. Thousands of fragments, more than 900 different documents, eventually identified. The material was purchased by the Palestine Archaeological Museum and divided among an international team of scholars, whose access policy would become one of the more embarrassing episodes in the history of academic biblical studies. For decades, the majority of the Dead Sea Scrolls were simply unavailable to anyone outside the small editorial committee. You could not see them, could not check the scholar's work, could not independently verify readings of disputed passages. The scrolls were theoretically accessible to humanity and practically locked away. Among the fragments that sat unpublished for the longest time was a group designated 4Q521. 36 years passed between their discovery in 1956 and their first critical publication in 1992. The publication came from Émile Puech of the École biblique et archéologique française in Jerusalem, the same institution that had produced Roland de Vaux, the institution that had been at the center of Dead Sea Scroll scholarship from the beginning. Puech published his analysis in the Revue de Qumran, the peer-reviewed journal devoted specifically to the study of the Qumran texts, and their historical context. The dating of the fragments, based on the paleographic analysis of the script style, placed their composition at between 100 and 50 BCE, more than half a century before the crucifixion. What the fragments describe is what the Messiah will do when God's kingdom arrives, not metaphorically, not poetically. As a checklist, the text is explicit. The Messiah will heal the wounded. He will give life to the dead, raise them. He will announce good news to the poor. He will give sight to the blind. He will straighten those who are bent. He will free the captive. The scholarly community that read Puech's publication knew immediately what they were looking at. John J. Collins, at the time Holmes Professor of Old Testament Criticism and Interpretation at Yale University Divinity School, analyzed 4Q521 in his 1995 work, The Scepter and the Star, The Messiahs of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Other Ancient Literature, published by Doubleday. Joseph Fitzmyer, Jesuit scholar, Professor Emeritus at the Catholic University of America, whose 2-volume commentary on Luke in the Anchor Bible series is the standard scholarly reference for Luke's Gospel, addresses the parallel directly in his commentary. The assessment across these scholars is consistent. The checklist in 4Q521 and the response Jesus gives in Luke 7 to the disciples of John the Baptist are drawing on the same tradition, or one is dependent on the prior existence of the other. Here is what Luke 7 records. John the Baptist is in prison. He sends his disciples to Jesus with the most direct question in the Gospels. Are you the one who is to come, or should we look for someone else? Jesus responds not with a theological argument, not with a claim about his identity, but with the list. The blind see, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news proclaimed to them. That is a checklist, and the checklist matches 4Q521 with a specificity that cannot be explained as coincidence or generic messianic expectation. These are the same actions in the same categories with the same organizing logic. The Messiah's arrival is demonstrated by what happens to those at the margins, the sick, the blind, the poor, the dead. The 1992 publication date of 4Q521 closes the only remaining borrowing argument. Luke's Gospel was written between 80 and 90 CE, using source materials, a source scholars call Q, shared with Matthew, that are themselves older. There is no world in which Luke's author, writing in the 80s CE, borrowed from a scroll fragment that sat unpublished in a museum in Jerusalem until 1992. The direction is reversed. The pre-Christian Jewish community at Qumran established a specific messianic expectations checklist. The Gospel records Jesus invoking that same checklist to answer a question from prison. What 4Q521 makes visible is that the question John's disciples carry to Jesus, "Are you the one who is to come?" is not a new question born out of confusion about Jesus specifically. It is a question with a very old, very specific answer already embedded in the theological expectations of Second Temple Judaism. The answer was written down in a cave in the Judean desert in the 1st century BCE by people who never heard of Jesus. Those fragments are in the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem. 36 years they sat in a drawer, unpublished. When they finally came out, what they showed was that the job description for the Messiah, the exact checklist version, the same one Jesus invokes when answering whether he is that Messiah, had already been written, in ink, in the desert, more than half a century before the life the Gospels describe. Either the Qumran community wrote down what they were waiting for, or the person who answered John's question from prison had read their homework. Number 4. The Yom Kippur atonement architecture. In 1968, Benjamin Mazar, one of the founders of Israeli archaeology, former president of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, began excavating the southwestern corner of the Temple Mount. The dig would run for a decade. Among the finds was a large stone block, one of thousands that had fallen from the Temple Mount parapet during the Roman destruction of 70 CE, when the Roman general Titus tore the temple apart stone by stone. The block had a Hebrew inscription carved into one edge, Labet ha-Teteki, Alahav, to the place of trumpeting to pro. The rest was broken off. The trumpeting stone. It marked the spot where a priest would stand on Sabbaths and at the major festivals to blow the shofar, announcing the sacred time to Jerusalem. Mazar's excavation confirmed in physical stone what Josephus had described in words, and what the Mishnah had preserved in institutional memory. The temple was real. Its layout was precisely as the ancient sources recorded. Its stones were exactly where the texts said they would be. The trumpeting stone is now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. You can see it. But the trumpeting stone is context. What matters here is the ritual enacted inside the temple it once stood on, a ritual performed every autumn for centuries before Jesus was born, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And what that ritual reveals is the theological architecture that the entire Christian doctrine of atonement is built on top of, point for point, with a precision that goes far beyond typology. Jacob Milgrom spent 40 years of his scholarly life on this question. The result was a 3-volume commentary on Leviticus in the Anchor Bible series, published by Doubleday between 1991 and 2001. That is the definitive modern analysis of the sacrificial system and its theological logic. Milgrom was not a Christian. He was not writing to explain the New Testament. He was a Hebrew Bible scholar at the University of California at Berkeley, trying to understand what the Levitical legislation meant on its own terms. What he demonstrates, rigorously, is that the Yom Kippur ritual is a 2-animal atonement mechanism. 2 animals, selected at the beginning of the day. 2 distinct functions, together accomplishing what neither can do alone. The first animal was slaughtered. Its blood was the ritual instrument. The high priest, and only the high priest, no other person, on no other day of the year, entered the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary, separated from the rest of the temple by the great veil, accessible to no other human being. He brought the blood of the slaughtered animal into this space and applied it to the copperat, the mercy seat, the cover of the Ark of the Covenant, atoning for the sins of the entire community. The blood accomplished what nothing else could. It brought atonement before God. The second animal was not killed. It was the scapegoat, the Sa'ir la Azazel, the goat designated by Lot for Azazel, sent into the wilderness. The high priest laid both hands on this animal's head and confessed over it all the sins and transgressions and rebellions of the people of Israel. Everything they had done, named and named again over the animal. Then a designated person led the goat out of Jerusalem, 12 miles into the wilderness, to a place called Bet Hudo, where the goat was driven off a cliff. The sins of the community went with it, into the wilderness, removed. Not atoned for by blood, that was the first animal's function, but expelled, taken away, sent out of the camp entirely. Two animals, two mechanisms, one slaughtered, blood brought into the holiest space, atonement made before God, one sent away carrying the sins of the people, never to return. Together they accomplished the complete transaction, the offense against God addressed by the blood offering, and the accumulated burden of the community's sin physically removed and sent away. Now read the letter to the Hebrews. The author, writing somewhere between 65 and 90 CE, almost certainly a Jewish Christian theologian with detailed knowledge of temple ritual, builds the central argument of the entire letter around the Yom Kippur service. The argument is not analogical or loose. It is systematic, technical, and precise. Jesus is the high priest who enters the true Holy of Holies, not the earthly one built by human hands, but the heavenly sanctuary of which the temple was a copy. Jesus enters not with the blood of an animal, but with his own blood, offered once, accomplishing permanently what the annual ritual could only accomplish temporarily. Jesus as the sacrifice, Jesus as the scapegoat, led outside the city, bearing the sins of the people, sent into the wilderness of death, so that what is laid on him is removed from those who confessed it. The mapping in Hebrews is meticulous. Every structural feature of the Yom Kippur service has a Christological counterpart. The author is not inventing a new theological framework. The author is arguing that a specific death fulfills an existing framework, one that has been physically enacted in Jerusalem every autumn for centuries. The framework is older than the crucifixion by the entire history of the Israelite sacrificial system. Josephus describes the temple ritual in his Jewish Antiquities. The Mishnah tractate Yoma preserves the procedural details of the Yom Kippur service with extraordinary specificity. The prayers, the sequence, the exact words the high priest speaks while laying his hands on the scapegoat. Milgram's commentary provides the analytical framework, and Mazar's excavation of the southwestern Temple Mount gives us the physical stones. Christianity's central claim that one death accomplishes complete, permanent atonement for sin is not a theological novelty invented to explain an unexpected event. It is a claim, made after a specific death, that this death fulfilled an atonement structure that had been enacted in physical ritual, in stone and blood, and an animal driven 12 miles into the desert, in Jerusalem, every autumn, for centuries. The architecture of atonement was already standing when the crucifixion happened. The letter to the Hebrews is not explaining a new theology. It is claiming a fulfillment. Whether the claim is true is a different question, but the architecture it claims to fulfill is real, physical, documented, and ancient, and it predates Christianity by the entire length of the Second Temple period. Number 3, 11Q, MEL, CHIZ, EDEK. In 1956, Bedouin tribesmen brought a collection of fragments to the Palestine Archaeological Museum in Jerusalem. They had found them in Cave 11 at Qumran, the last major cave to yield significant material worked by the Bedouin before archaeologists could reach it. The museum purchased the fragments and cataloged them. 9 years later, a delay that reflects both the complexity of the material and the resource constraints of the small team working the Dead Sea Scrolls, a Dutch scholar named A.S. van der Wood published the first critical edition of one of the most theologically surprising texts in the collection. He published it in 1965 in Oud Testamentische Studien, the Journal of the Old Testament Society of the Netherlands. The text received the standard Qumran designation, 11Q Melchizedek. 13 legible lines on papyrus so fragile that handling it had already cost portions of the document. Dated paleographically, by the specific features of the handwriting style, to between 100 and 75 BCE. And in those 13 lines, a portrait of Melchizedek that nothing in the previously known ancient literature had prepared anyone to find. Melchizedek appears twice in the Hebrew scriptures that were known before the Dead Sea Scrolls. Once in Genesis, briefly, as the priest king of Salem who meets Abraham after a battle and receives a tithe from him. Once in the Psalms, a single verse, Psalm 110, in which a future king priest is designated as serving in the order of Melchizedek. That is the entirety of the Melchizedek tradition in the canonical Hebrew text. 2 appearances, brief, cryptic, a figure who materializes, blesses, receives a tithe, and disappears from the narrative. In 11Q Melchizedek, he is something entirely different. The text describes Melchizedek as a heavenly being, not a historical ancestor from the patriarchal period, not a human priest-king, but an exalted figure operating in the divine realm at the consummation of history. And this heavenly Melchizedek performs a set of specific functions. He proclaims liberty to captives. The text quotes the Jubilee passage from Leviticus, the declaration of release that was supposed to come every 50 years, but applies it not to agricultural debt or the release of slaves, but to spiritual liberation from sin and bondage to demonic forces. He atones for the sins of the children of light, using the exact technical vocabulary of the temple atonement cult, but locating that atonement in the heavenly sanctuary rather than the earthly one. He leads the children of light in defeating Belial, the figure of evil, the adversary, and the spirits of his lot, the demonic forces aligned against God's people. He executes divine judgment at the final reckoning. And all of this occurs at the eschatological moment, the final jubilee, the end of the age, the culmination of history. Florentino Garcia Martinez of the University of Groningen, in his 1994 compilation The Dead Sea Scrolls, translated, published by Brill in the Netherlands and Eerdmans in the United States, provides the standard critical translation of 11Q Melchizedek. The scholarly consensus established through Van der Wood's original analysis, Garcia Martinez's subsequent work, and John J. Collins's engagement at Yale is clear. 11Q Melchizedek represents a pre-Christian Jewish tradition of Melchizedek as an exalted heavenly redeemer, not a human type, not an ancestor whose priestly status matters as precedent, a figure who functions in the cosmic drama of the end times as the agent of God's liberation, atonement, and judgment. Now look at the letter to the Hebrews. The author, the same Jewish Christian theologian who mapped the crucifixion onto the Yom Kippur structure with such precision, builds a second argument, spanning 5 chapters, for what scholars call a Melchizedekian high priesthood. The argument is intricate, theologically sophisticated, and it presupposes something that the 2 brief canonical appearances of Melchizedek could not by themselves supply. The audience already carries a rich Melchizedek tradition. The author of Hebrews does not explain Melchizedek to readers who have never thought about him. The author develops an existing tradition, applies it, extends it, and the application works only if the readers understand Melchizedek as already a figure of cosmic and eschatological significance, not just a minor patriarchal precedent. Before 11Q Melchizedek was published, the standard scholarly position was that the author of Hebrews was doing creative biblical interpretation, mining an obscure figure from Genesis and a single verse in the Psalms for typological significance that the original texts didn't really support. It looked like theological ingenuity stretching thin material. After 11Q Melchizedek, that explanation collapsed. The Melchizedek tradition was already rich, already fully developed as a heavenly redeemer concept, already circulating in Jewish communities in the century before Hebrews was written. The author of Hebrews is not inventing. The author is applying a recognized and developed theological framework to a specific person. The letter to the Hebrews is making the claim that Jesus of Nazareth is this Melchizedekian figure, the heavenly high priest who enters the true sanctuary with his own blood, who proclaims liberty to captives, who atones for the sins of the children of light, who defeats the adversary, who inaugurates the final jubilee. Whether that claim is true is a theological question. But the framework within which the claim is made, the role, the vocabulary, the cosmic function, was already in circulation, already written down, in 13 legible lines on a fragile piece of papyrus in a cave in the Judean desert, at least a century before the events the letter to the Hebrews describes. Van der Woud published his analysis in 1965. Garcia Martinez's translation is in print. The fragments are held between the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem and the Rockefeller Museum. And the 13 lines of 11Q Melchizedek remain what they were when the Bedouin pulled them out of Cave 11 in 1956. Evidence of a pre-Christian Jewish heavenly Redeemer figure, already fully formed, already waiting, written in the desert before the story anyone applied him to had begun. Number 2. The Gabriel Stone and the 3-day resurrection. The stone arrived in the antiquities market without clear documentation of where, exactly, it came from. Sometime around the late 1990s or the very beginning of the 2000s, no one knows precisely when, a large, flat basalt stone was found somewhere along the eastern shore of the Dead Sea, on land that is now part of Jordan. The circumstances of its discovery are unverified. At some point, it entered the private collection of David Jesselson, a Swiss-Israeli collector based in Zurich, and then it sat, private and largely unknown, until Ada Yardeni examined it. Ada Yardeni is the preeminent authority on ancient Hebrew and Aramaic script. The paleographer scholars turn to when the question is what a manuscript's handwriting can tell us about when and where it was written. She examined the Gabriel Stone and dated the script to the late 1st century BCE. The inscription covers one face of the stone, approximately 3 feet tall, 87 lines of text in 2 columns, written in ink rather than carved. Ink on stone is unusual. Ink on stone is also fragile. Water, handling, and the passage of 20 centuries had damaged portions of the surface, leaving sections illegible. Yardeni and Benjamin Elitzer published a preliminary description and transcription in 2007. The following year, Israel Knoll, professor of Bible studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, one of the significant voices in Second Temple Judaism scholarship, the author of a previous study on the origins of the divine sanctuary concept, published a reading of the full text in the Revue Biblique, the peer-reviewed journal of biblical and archaeological studies that has been in continuous publication since 1892. Knoll's reading of line 80 produced a phrase that, if his reading is correct, has implications that are very difficult to overstate. The inscription, he argued, describes a messianic figure addressed as the Prince of Princes. This figure undergoes suffering. He is apparently killed. And then an angelic voice, possibly Gabriel, which is why the stone acquired the name Hazon Gabriel, Vision of Gabriel, commands him, "In 3 days you shall live." Knoll developed his full interpretation in a 2009 book, Messiah Before Jesus, published by the University of California Press. His argument was that the Gabriel stone records a pre-Christian Jewish messianic tradition in which a suffering Messiah is expected to die and rise from the dead after 3 days, and that this tradition was available in the cultural environment that shaped both the Qumran community and early Christianity. The 3-day resurrection timeline in this reading was not invented by the disciples of Jesus after the discovery of the empty tomb. It was already part of the expected script for what a dying and rising Messiah did. The disciples would have had a framework for interpreting what they believed they had experienced. The scholarly response was serious and divided. John J. Collins at Yale examined the reading and found it plausible. The broader framework of a suffering Messiah connected to resurrection expectations was, he noted, consistent with other Second Temple evidence. Moshe Bar Asher, then president of the Academy of the Hebrew Language in Jerusalem, and Michael Wise, the Aramaic scholar, disputed Knoll's reading of line 80. The damage to the stone at precisely the most theologically consequential line, line 80, means that the crucial word or words exist only partially. The reading that yields, "In 3 days you shall live," depends on reconstructing letters that are no longer clearly visible. What is not in dispute is the physical object itself. The Gabriel stone exists. Its dating to the late 1st century BCE is accepted across the scholarly literature. Its 87 lines describe messianic expectation, suffering divine intervention, eschatological warfare, and the proclamation of liberty in a pre-Christian Jewish context. The question is specifically, and only line 80, and the question cannot be resolved without access to the stone itself for comprehensive technical examination. That examination has not been completed. Full multispectral imaging, the technology that recovers invisible text from damaged surfaces by photographing manuscripts under multiple wavelength bands of light. The same technology that has resolved disputed readings in other ancient documents has not been commissioned for the Gabriel stone. The reason is simple and frustrating. The stone is in private hands in Zurich. It is not in a museum. It is not under institutional management. It is not available for the kind of unrestricted, comprehensive scholarly examination that would settle the reading of line 81 way or the other. If Noel is right, if line 80 reads, "In 3 days you shall live," then the 3-day resurrection framework was not invented in the aftermath of the crucifixion to make sense of an experience no one had any prior category for. It was already in writing, in a pre-Christian Jewish context, as an established feature of how Messianic death and vindication were expected to unfold. If Bar Asher and Wise are right, if the reading is too damaged to sustain, then the Gabriel Stone is still a significant document, still evidence of pre-Christian Jewish Messianic suffering theology, still worth the attention it has received. Just not the specific evidence Noel claims. The stone knows the answer. It has known for 20 centuries. It is sitting in a private collection in Zurich, with a partially obscured line at position 80, and the scholars who need unrestricted access to settle this question have not yet been given it. That is where the question stands. Not in a laboratory, not in a settled consensus, not in a published resolution. In Zurich, in private hands, waiting. Number 1. The Teacher of Righteousness and the Hodayat Hymns. In early 1947, a teenage Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Edashdib was searching for a lost goat in the cliffs above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into a dark opening in the limestone cliff face and heard something shatter inside. He told his cousins. They went back. They lowered themselves into the cave and found ceramic jars. Inside the jars, wrapped in linen, sealed against the desert air that had preserved them for 2,000 years, were scrolls. The cave would be catalogued as Cave 1 at Qumran. It held 7 scrolls, among them the longest document in the collection, the Great Isaiah Scroll, 11 meters of parchment. Also among the Cave 1 scrolls, receiving far less public attention in the decades since, was a document designated 1QH. Its title comes from the Hebrew word hodayat, thanksgiving, praise. It is a collection of 42 hymns, written in the first person, preserved on a scroll 1.8 meters long, composed of 18 sewn sheets of animal skin. Giza Vermes of Oxford University, one of the most significant Dead Sea Scrolls scholars of the 20th century, whose translation Dead Sea Scrolls in English went through 5 editions between 1962 and 2004, identified within the Hodayat a specific subset of hymns that he designated the teacher hymns. These hymns, Vermes argued based on their distinctive literary character, their theological depth, and their internal first-person perspective, were composed by the figure referred to in multiple other Qumran documents as the Moreh HaTzedek, the teacher of righteousness. George Brooke of the University of Manchester, a leading textual scholar of the Dead Sea Scrolls, has affirmed and extended this identification in subsequent scholarship. The teacher of righteousness is not a peripheral figure in the Qumran community's self-understanding. He is their founder, the defining authority, the person around whom the entire community formed. The Damascus Document identifies him as the one who founded the community and interpreted the law for them in the last days. The Habakkuk Pesher, a verse-by-verse commentary on the prophet Habakkuk, found in Cave 1, records a specific historical conflict. The teacher was persecuted by a figure the Pesher calls the wicked priest, identified by most scholars as one of the Hasmonean leaders who took control of the Jerusalem high priesthood by political force in the 2nd century BCE, probably Jonathan or Simon Maccabee. According to the Pesher, the wicked priest pursued the teacher of righteousness on the Day of Atonement, the most sacred day of the Jewish calendar, attempting to destroy him and the community gathered around him. The teacher was almost certainly a Zadokite priest, a member of the legitimate hereditary priestly line, displaced from temple service by the Hasmonean usurpation of the high priesthood. Stripped of the institutional role that defined his identity, he went into the desert. He gathered followers. He wrote. What he wrote, the hymns Vermes and Brooke identify as his, constitutes the most significant body of non-canonical Second Temple poetry in existence. That assessment belongs to John Strugnell of Harvard University, one of the original editorial team members for the Dead Sea Scrolls, a scholar who spent decades working through the material. It is a considered, technical judgment from someone with more direct familiarity with the corpus than almost anyone of his generation. And the content of those hymns is where the conversation stops being merely archaeologically interesting and becomes something harder to categorize. The speaker of the teacher hymns describes a life whose contours are, in their structural features, deeply and repeatedly familiar. He says he was called from the womb, set apart before birth for a specific mission, designated by God before his formation was complete. He says his mission is oriented toward those the community rule calls the Anawin, the poor, the afflicted, the meek, the ones overlooked by power. The congregation of the poor is the community gathered around him. He says the religious establishment of Jerusalem, the priests, the authorities, the keepers of the official institutional religion of his day, has rejected him, has pursued him, has sought his destruction. He says someone within his own community, someone close to him, someone who had been part of the inner circle, betrayed him. He describes suffering not as evidence of God's abandonment, but as the specific path through which God's purposes are being carried forward, as the form that faithfulness takes when the world resists the truth being revealed through him. And he describes certainty, not hope, not aspiration, but absolute documented certainty of vindication, that everything he has suffered will be seen in God's eschatological moment as the working of divine design. Called from the womb, mission to the poor, rejected by the religious establishment, betrayed from within, suffering as divine purpose, certain of vindication. John Strugnell at Harvard called the teacher hymns the most significant non-canonical Second Temple poetry ever discovered. The reason that assessment carries weight, the reason the Hodayot have received the scholarly attention they have, is not that they are particularly beautiful poetry, though they are. It is that they describe a life with structural features so specific and so aligned with a particular later narrative that no scholar who engages the text carefully can simply ignore the parallel. 3 positions have been staked out in the literature, none of which has decisively prevailed. The first is that the resemblance is coincidental or conventional, that certain features of a religiously significant life, calling from the womb, mission to the marginalized, conflict with authorities, betrayal, suffering, vindication, recur across traditions because they are the available narrative elements for describing someone who mattered. And the resemblance between the teacher hymns and the gospel accounts reflects shared literary convention rather than historical relationship. The second is that the early Christian movement was consciously or unconsciously shaped by the teacher of righteousness tradition in its biographical portrait of Jesus, that the gospel narratives, composed decades after the crucifixion, were influenced by the existing profile of the teacher, and that some of the biographical details that make Jesus' life fit the pattern so precisely are the result of that influence rather than independent historical reporting. The third is that the teacher of righteousness was genuinely anticipatory, that the same God who moved the teacher of righteousness was involved in both lives, that the pattern is real because it reflects something true about how the divine works in human history, and that the Hodayot describe a type that was then realized, completed, and transcended in a specific person a century and a half later. What none of those 3 positions can do is make the parallels go away. The scroll is 1.8 meters of preserved animal skin, 1 QH from Cave 1, housed in the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. The man who wrote the hymns it contains was active somewhere between 150 and 100 BCE. He was a priest displaced from his institution by political usurpers. He gathered a community of followers in the desert around a vision of genuine covenant life. The religious establishment of Jerusalem pursued him. Someone in his inner community betrayed him. He suffered. He wrote hymns about being called from the womb to a mission to the poor. He was certain he would be vindicated. His community kept his hymns for at least a century after his death. They buried them in a jar in a cave, sealed against the desert air, around the time the Romans arrived to destroy Jerusalem. And in 1947, a teenage shepherd with a lost goat found them. Whether the teacher of righteousness was the architect of a pattern that a later life completed, or whether the gospel narratives absorbed and redeployed his template, or whether the same design moves in human history more than once, that is not a question archaeology can answer. The scroll is behind glass in Jerusalem. The hymns are in print. The man who wrote them left no grave marker, no named tomb, no record of what happened to him at the end. He left 42 hymns, and the last of them is still asking the question that the whole series of entries in this video has been circling around, which is whether the pattern was waiting for something or whether the pattern was the thing itself. That question is open. The scroll is 1.8 meters long. The hymns are 42. And the answer, if there is one, is somewhere in the distance between the teacher of righteousness and the person who walked out of Galilee 100 years after he stopped writing. If this is the kind of content that keeps pulling you back, subscribe. That's the whole ask. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and we've got more of this coming. More excavations, more manuscripts, more discoveries that turn out to mean more than anyone said they did when they were first found. Hit subscribe. We'll see you on the next one.